Hello and welcome everyone to the final Global 60s colloquium for this calendar year. We are very, very happy to have a very distinguished group of people and colleagues and dear friends that are with us tonight or today or this morning, wherever you are, since we're going truly international. We're going to talk about revolutionizing transitions, 50 years since the democratization of Portugal and Greece. And we have a group of colleagues here who have done an amazing contribution to the field of global 60s research through their monograph, through their research in a variety of shapes and forms. And we have an absolute wonderful host that is going to walk you through today's session. And my job really is only to introduce her, who is then in turn going to introduce all of the panelists, who will then give brief statements, and then we're going to have a conversation about their work and anything and everything that you can come up with from the audience. So it's my utmost pleasure to welcome you to this panel and its host, namely Pamela B. Radcliffe, who's going to moderate tonight's session. She is a professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. She earned a bachelor's degree from Scripps College and her master's and PhD degrees in history from Columbia University. She's a historian of modern Spain whose research is focused on mass politics, gender, civil society, and democratic transitions. She's the author of three wonderful single-authored monographs. The first one, From Mobilization to Civil War, The Politics of Polarization in the Spanish City of Gijón, from Cambridge University Press, published in 1996. The second, Making Democratic Citizens in Spain, Civil Society and the Popular Origins of the Transition 1960 to 1978, published with Pelgraph in 2011. And number three, The History of Modern Spain, 1808 until the Present, published by Wiley Blackwell in 2017. In addition to these individual works, she also co-authored Constructing Spanish Womanhood, Female Identity in Modern Spain with Victoria Enders, published by SUNY Press in 1999. And her most recent other articles and chapters include early 20th century popular mobilization and labor movements from the Restoration to the Second Republic and the Routledge Companion to the 20th Century, Spain, that is currently in press, the historiography of the Spanish Civil War in the Oxford Handbook on the Spanish Civil War, and Municipalism and Democratization in Modern Spanish History, published this year in a volume called Rethinking the History of Democracy in Spain. So we're very, very happy to welcome Professor Radcliffe. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Martin. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here and introduce these three speakers, both because I've had an opportunity to read all their work and have long admired them. I wrote a book review of Guya's book when it came out, and I've worked more recently with Kostis and Nikos on a co-edited special issue on the transitions in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, which came out with Melange. So, you know, I've worked with all three of them, which is wonderful. It's also a great pleasure just to see how far the research on the Southern European transitions, you know, has come since I started working on it. You know, my own book on Spain, I started my research in the early 20th century, and really, you know, there was no kind of historical in-depth and certainly kind of bottom-up research that was being done on the transitions at that time. You know, so really all three of the books and the publications of these authors really reflect this kind of, you know, deepening, right, of the story of the transitions, not only as something that happened in a brief moment of, you know, high politics change, but, you know, as in the title of Guya's book, you know, the transition before the transition, right? Things that happened before and then sort of into the legacies of those political changes afterwards. So, you know, that's really the breadth and depth of what we get to talk about today. So I'm going to start by introducing Kostis Kornetis. And he's an assistant professor of contemporary history at the Universidad Autónoma in Madrid. He's taught history at Brown University and New York University in the United States, at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and he has had a prestigious Konex Marie Curie Experience Fellowship at the Universidad Carlos III, and he was a Santander Fellow in Iberian Studies at St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. So the monograph that's sort of the center of what, of his research for this conversation was Children of the Dictatorship, Student Resistance, Cultural Politics, and the Long 60s in Greece, which was also awarded the Edmund Keeley Book Award of the Modern Greek Studies Association. He's also co-edited a number of books, so he's also been involved in sort of bringing together research on these subjects. These include the 1969 Greek case at the Council of Europe, A Game Change for Human Rights, published by Bloomsbury in 2024. A second co-edited book, Consumption and Gender in Southern Europe Since the Long 1960s, also Bloomsbury 2016. And Rethinking Democratization in Spain, Greece, and Portugal, published by Palgrave in 2019. And then his new monograph, which we are all expecting with bated breath, coming out with Oxford University Press, is a collective biography of Southern European democratization, the age of transition.
Great. Thank you so much, Pamela, for your kind introduction. I would like to thank the Global 60s Colloquium, in particular, my friend, old friend and colleague and editor, Martin Klimke. So it's a great pleasure to be here, also alongside Guya and Nikos, who have been friends and fellow travelers for a long time. So let me try and share a very basic PowerPoint presentation with you. Okay. Right, can you see it? Yeah, wonderful. So one of the main ideas of the book came out, as you can see, like 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago. And one of the main ideas and goals of the book was to investigate in depth the relationship between the international and the local dimension of the anti-dictatorship student movement in Greece from 67 to 74. Very much, I mean, what I had in mind was that I really wanted, apart from highlighting the specificities of that particular movement, I also wanted to highlight the similarities, of course, and differences with the experiences with students in Western Europe and beyond around what we call 68, hence the title that refers to Jean-Luc Godard's legendary film Children of Marx and Coca-Cola, and which is very often been associated to 68. So I wanted to place Greece in this kind of broader context, what we call the long 60s, this famous long decade that spans from the late 1950s to the mid 1970s. And I really wanted to focus not only on the ruptures brought by the coup, the colonel's coup in April 1967, but and the dictatorship that came after, but also some of the continuities that one can observe in terms of the country's development. Here, for example, tourism, that is a major issue. Well, you know, this is John Lennon in December 1967 in Athens, and this is many months after the coup d'etat. So you can see there that, you know, the dictatorship did not just seal off Greece entirely from the rest of the world. And then you have other trends like consumerism and so on. The aim was to kind of break that kind of idea of, let's say, Greek isolationism or exceptionalism rather. And I was also going against this view of Greece as a hidden pioneer or a laggard of European developments. So I had two basic working hypotheses. One was that as I said, economic and social transformations that started before 67, they continued and maybe were even reinforced after 67. Tourism is a great example of that, mass tourism. The second is that there were ruptures in terms of student culture and youth culture, of course, because things changed very much in the universities. But again, we can observe similarities with what was going abroad. These are two of the kernels here. And this is, I focused on two generations. One generation that I called Generation Z. And you can see here, it's a generation that evolved around the death of Grigoris Lambrakis, internalized afterwards by Costa Gavras in the eponymous film. So that was a generation that was kind of influenced by what happened before 67. And then a second generation that we see here, which is called Polytechnic generation, which was much more in touch with campuses abroad. And I would add also the fact that many of the what we call the Polytechnic generation came of age during the dictatorship with a student movement that really reached the climax in 72, 73. Many of them came from families which were bourgeois, conservative. So very, very different, let's say, from student socialization, especially on the left before them. So, and then you can see here, this is an image from the apogee of the student movement, which was the 3-day Polytechnic occupation in November 1973. I call this part of the movement glocal, right? So it's a generation that, if you like, was thinking in global terms, even though it operated locally. And this is not just May 68 or the American counterculture. You can see here Woodstock, right? The the Greek kind of rendering of that of the name in the marquee, but then also Chile and Thailand, and I would say that third worldism is really important for them. Ultimately, and then we have all kinds of cultural transfers that affected the political publishing, political cinema, like local political cinema, political theater, we can see that here, or political song here. So I would say that there is another thing beyond politics that I try to stress in the book, and that has to do with everyday life. It has to do with a kind of new way of life. These young people suffocating in a dictatorship in the late 60s and early 70s in Greece, trying to connect with what was going on abroad. There were some interesting channels, by the way, students, Greek students abroad. There would be vehicles of information. Many were in Italy, for example. And I was reading a phrase by the famous Italian director Bernardo Bertolucci, where he said that once upon a time in the long 1960s, when you went to bed, when you went to sleep, you had the impression that you would wake up in the future, which meant a place or a space where everything was possible. In 68, the point was to change the world, concludes Bertolucci. And I believe that some of this was shared, this conviction, by the Greek students, who clearly imagined that they could change Greek society to the better. This is from the law school occupation. It's like let's say, right before laying the ground for the Polytechnic occupation. You can see here also the avalanche of women students in the forefront. This is so new. And we can of course talk about this too. I'm going to come back in the last 2 minutes that I have. Let me say just a few words about research. The obstacles were great for me, mainly due to the absence of primary research on the 7 years in general or the long 60s. as a result of which I had to try to reconstruct, let's say, very basic things before I proceeded with being more analytical. I believe that today, 10 years, 11 years later, we are in an entirely different climate. And of course, Nico's own book came, I think, a couple of years afterwards, and it's part of let's say, a path of more in-depth studies that had to do not just with the kernel dictatorship and student socialization or militancy, but also the transition to democracy. The book is heavily based on oral history. It proved to be a powerful research tool for me. It is a powerful research tool when we deal with collective action, social movements, with a traumatic experience of everyday life under a dictatorship. A major problem for me had to do with the mythologizing or the demonizing of the Polytechnic generation. I had to try to demystify it. I had to see them in their real human dimensions, remove the shell of heroism of the superheroes, as it were, and see them in, let's say, in the real dimensions, like young people who at a very young age took on the burden of resistance against the junta, and basically children with parents who scolded them, who were experimenting sexually. And we are, of course, talking about an era in which sexuality could also be a political act, and where there was an almost magical relation between the private sphere, companionship, and political mobilization. So, what we later called, of course, the personal is political. I think we can already see that then. Finally, sorry, this is the image that I used also for the cover of the book from the Polytechnic uprising, November 1973. I'd like to say that I radically disagree with the opposite perspective to the heroization, which sees this generation exclusively as a bearer of ills, suffering. It's the generation that destroyed Greece. It's a very widespread idea, very popular. Everything would be better in Greece without had the Polytechnic not taken place. This is a very, let's say, revisionist view that has gained currency in the past few years, involving Cyprus, that even the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in July 1974 would not have happened had the students not exploded against the colonels. So I would therefore like the book to function as a catalyst for us to rethink the Polytechnic and its generation, also in Greece, also for Greek readers, I mean. And this was a movement that not only canceled the junta's infamous controlled liberalization experiment, the opening up, but I would say that they also open up the way to modernization for the entire Greek society. I would say that Greece's rapid modernization after 1974, sorry, this is the bloody ending of the Polytechnic, and this is the first Polytechnic anniversary in November 1974. You can see here an avalanche of people. This really became the lieu de mémoire par excellence and the legitimizing force behind the Greek transition to democracy. It's the transition from below. So last two words, I would say that Greece's rapid modernization after 74 in terms of culture, intellect, mores, social class, political and social rights had very much to do with this generation and with this emblematic moment, things that today we take for granted, and we shouldn't. All right. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kostas. So maybe I could just ask a couple of questions here before we move on to the next speaker, and then afterwards, we can have sort of a broader conversation as well. But so, one of the things that I was thinking when you began about your goal, to situate Greece in the international context, to transcend that kind of notion of Greece, and this fits Portugal as well as Spain, right, as kind of laggard countries that weren't really, at the center of European culture and politics and all of that. But you really were thinking about the framework of the global 60s, as opposed to, and I'm putting words in your mouth here, as opposed to really thinking about the transitions, right, to
Mhm.
democracy as sort of your framework. So how do you think about the sort of difference there? What are the implications of thinking about your research, through the lens of, comparative transitions, right, versus global 60s?
Uh, that's a great question. I think it's a bit of I at least in my work, and it has very much to do with a new monograph that is coming up that you mentioned, and that I have been discussing with with several people also in this panel a lot. It is that it's a bit of it's a follow-up story. So I don't think we can really understand the transitions, the dynamism of the transitions in terms of social movements, in terms of counterculture, if we don't look at the beginning before the beginning, basically, right? You talked about the revolution before the revolution in terms of the Portuguese case, but here it is the beginning before the beginning, and it precedes the transition. I would say that in terms of the Greek case in particular, it really provided the student movement that I talked about. It really provided, let's say, the major toolkit for social action, for political action, for what it means to be young, what it means to be radical, also within a broader context, right? Not just in terms of the Greek parameters there and coordinates. It really is absolutely connected to the 1972-1973 student movement that I talked about. So I see they're absolutely linked and interconnected.
What about, this is more of a sort of, methodological question, or, historiographical question. You talk about, so, your book is really all three of your books are fundamental in terms of focusing on the social movements and their role, right, in these events. But, you also talk about wanting to go beyond social movements politics, right, to look at the history of everyday life,
Yeah.
right? So you talked about, that sense of possibility, that sense of transformation. So, how would you sort of pursue, right, a history of everyday life, right, in those transition eras, and what kinds of different, tools and questions and resources and sources would you use to do that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I believe that we are entering a space of the history of everyday life. It kind of, beyond strictly institutional terms, or even beyond the grassroots, if you like, as you also mentioned, the social movements. I would say. And there is an ERC at St. Andrews. Nikos is also, I think, part of it, on the history of everyday life and authoritarianism in Southern Europe, and it has a very comparative scope. It's led by Kate Ferris, and I think the takeaway from that, and I think for our kind of more local historiographies, is that we're kind of moving away from the spectacular to the non-spectacular, right? Beyond the binary of, let's say, consent versus resistance that structured and explained much of our, of the context until now. I think there are more and more works trying to explore gray zones, right? And of course, all these kind of myriads of micro social interactions that we have that go beyond that very kind of hard binary, right? And of course, there are micro resistance and micro freedoms to be found there. I'm not saying that this is not part of it. And if I can say like a last word on this, I believe that, interestingly enough, public history played a role regarding this. And this kind of series, TV series, which were very, very popular. It started off in Spain. So there you can see, I think, how it all connects. And then there was a spillover, first to Portugal and then to Greece with Cuéntame Cómo Pasó, right? And I'm saying that this was an important, I think, franchise because it focused on, let's say, the everyday life, on consumerism, on private life, on gender, on intergenerational relationships. So on materiality, which is huge, right? You know, taking away these objects, everyday objects from the museum and bringing them back into the living room. So I think it's very important. And finally, Alf Lütke's kind of old idea of the Alltagsgeschichte, again, I think Nikos has also used it in his own work, I think it's coming back. But now, you know, with this kind of course, public history through TV series has all kinds of fallacies. You know, it can be nostalgic, it can be aestheticized, but it's great for us. I think we can do much better everyday life history now, having had this kind of path, you know, being introduced by public history.
Thank you. Great answers to those questions. All right, so we will move to our second speaker, Guya Acornero. She is an assistant professor in political science at the University Institute of Lisbon and a researcher at the Center for Research and Studies in Sociology, where she's also the director of the Observatory of Democracy and Political Representation and the chair of the research group on politics and citizenship. She's worked on topics such as contentious governance, the emotional and cognitive dimensions of revolutionary processes and their memory, latency, and visibility and mobilization, particularly in the context of austerity and gentrification in Southern Europe, on the right to the city, and grassroots expertise. Her publications include, of course, what is the centerpiece of this discussion, the monograph, The Revolution Before the Revolution, Late Authoritarianism and Student Protest in Portugal. And she's also edited a book, Social Movement Studies in Europe, The State of the Art, co-edited with Olivier Villieu, and many, many articles in prominent journals in the field. So since 2014, she's also been sharing the monthly seminar on social movements and political action. And she's currently working with James Jasper on another edited forthcoming book called Interpreting Protest and Social Movements, which will come out in Bristol from Bristol University Press in 2026. So Guya.
Okay, so can you hear me? Yes? Thank you very much, Pamela, for this introduction, and thank you also to Martin for organizing this session. And it's our last chance to discuss the 50th anniversary of our transitions and revolution, because we are really at the end of the year of the 2024. So it's really a great pleasure to conclude this series of events celebrating these moments with you guys, because, you know, we were sharing during these years many reflections, and I think that our works were reciprocally influenced each other. So we are kind of reproducing this interactionism and interactionist perspective that Costis was mentioning before. I hope also in our own dialogues in these years. And thank you very much also, Pam, to be here and to discuss with us. Our work is always very enriching to discuss with you. So I'm very happy for that. And so this book has already some years. It was published in 2016 and after re-edited in some years after, I think 2018, I don't remember very well, but well, you can find all the information on the website. And from then, I think that my work passed through different phases, etc. But I still think that this book for me was a kind of very important moment, a crucial moment, and in it, I think that converge different reflections and works and the research I was carrying out before this book, before the publication of this book, and my following reflections and investigation in the years that arrive until now. But I can see still the deep connection between the previous and interest and the current interests that are much more focused on contemporary things and processes. So recently I was discussing with Costis about this thing that I just realized that my book title is The Revolution Before the Revolutions, and after I have all these kind of articles called The Memory of the Revolution, The Motion About the Past. So is everything or before the period before the revolution, on everything about how people remember the revolution, but nothing about the revolution in itself. So I think it's a curious, it was a curious reflection for me to do. And I think that the origin of this is that I'm always very interested in long-term processes. So I agree that the events are very important moments in shaping processes and dynamics and structures, and are very important, but without long-term processes, it's very difficult also to understand the event and their impact. So my focus was exactly on that. And so we all know that the Portugal dictatorship ended on the 25th of April after a coup d'etat, but without the huge mobilization that happened the day after, immediately, or even the same day, we wouldn't have a revolution and we wouldn't have the same transition in Portugal. So the huge popular mobilization made a difference in this context. My view of this huge mobilization, what I underline in my book, is that it was the last phase of a longer cycle of protests that started in Portugal at least in the late 60s and continued increasing in the early 70s. And this cycle of protests ended with the end of the revolution in 1976. And apart from being a national cycle of protests, it was also part of a larger wave of mobilization that coincided with the global 60s and the long 60s. So in this sense, I think that I try to overtake some previous understanding of the transition in Portugal, which were in any case fundamental for my work, what was done before, and which dialogue a lot, my work dialogue a lot with that. But I try to move a little bit further, particularly studies coming from the area of contemporary history. They already understood the Portuguese Revolution as a consequence of long-term processes, but without this social movement studies and theory background, that in my opinion is able to understand better the very processes and mechanisms at the basis of these long-term processes. On the side of political science studies, actually there was a kind of general understanding of the Portuguese transition as something elite-centered. So there was a particularly elite-centered perspective. Some sociological studies, for instance, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Braga da Cruz, etc., consider the mobilizations after the coup d'etat simply as a result of the sudden decompression of the society due to the coup d'etat, using the metaphor of the pressure cooker, which actually painted the Portuguese society as completely not mobilized, completely apathic until the day of the 25th of April. And so the revolution as a kind of exception in the context of the Portuguese political culture. And also first studying using social movement theory also reproduced partially this view, even if with other tools, for instance, attributing the mobilization of the PREC, of the revolution, to the sudden opening of political opportunity structure. So again, considering it as a result of an institutional open, in my view, not considering enough the power of the mobilization of the long-term structure and social structure in making this opening possible. So what I wanted to defend in this book, and I think is still a part of my work, is this more interactionist perspective, so that like suggests to look at the relationship between bottom-up and top-down processes as constantly co-building each other and as constantly influencing each other. And so as institution, the level of institution and social processes as mutually influencing. So not having a fully institutional moment that is provoking what happened in terms of civil society reaction or vice versa. So this constant interaction, that a little bit also what Costis was defending before, that is as being the focus of my book, and I think that is a little bit at the basis of my work until now. And now just to conclude, this doesn't mean that the coup-d'etat did not introduce a completely different political configuration, and this event was essential for having a revolution and for having whatever all the processes that happened in that moment of big change in terms of institutions. Is also the form of how Portuguese democracy was built, because it's a specific type of democracy, type of constitution, and type of institution that were forged in this moment. But the previous mobilizations helped actually to create collective identities, networks of mobilization, resources and competencies, also mobilization competencies and resources that made the diffusion of protests possible during the revolution. We know that many pragmatic things of protest and mobilization, like simply organizing a demonstration or an occupation, or managing an assembly, or meetings, etc., are not just things that can be improvised. People need to have skills to do that things. So these skills were created during these previous years, and they could be activated during the revolution for many reasons. And so I will stop here. We can maybe discuss more these aspects in the next sessions and the question and answers parts. But this is a little bit what I wanted to mention now.
Thank you, Guya. So again, I just want to ask you a couple of questions before we move on to our third speaker. So one of the things I can really hear, and if you read your book, it's the same, I can hear in your framing, right, is that sort of social movement theorization, right? The way of thinking about, everything from opportunity structure, right, to the kind of interaction between social movements and the state, and these sorts of tools that you use, right, to analyze your particular case. So maybe you can say a little bit about how the Portuguese case can contribute, right, in a more general way to our understanding of mobilization processes, right? So kind of extrapolating from your case, since this is the way, these are the tools that you bring to your case, so what can you bring out of the Portuguese case, right, to our understanding about this kind of mobilization process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, Pamela, for this question. I think that the Portuguese case it can tell us a lot about and in very different perspectives. First of all, because we used to see what I was saying, the dimension, the institutional dimension, and the civil society dimension, and the mobilization process, etc., something completely belonging to two different worlds, like very rigidly defined, with a strict border between them. And I think that the Portuguese case, as the way how the transition happened with fluidity of the identity of the actors, so actors that were part of the social movements, of course, because of the revolution, they took institutional charge, and also and vice versa, etc. So there is this kind of deep interaction between the two spheres of state and social movements, and this continues until now, I think. And this is also specific of a country as Portugal, which is characterized by the late industrialization. So also the social movement sectors is not so distant from institutions, so we don't have this kind of sector for mobilization of social movements that's completely something distinguished, like as for instance we have in Italy or France, etc., because of the working movement, etc. So here the Portuguese case to be a case also with specific condition in terms of geography, of history, at the let's say at the position in Europe, usually considered a peripheral condition, but also a bridge with other realities, for instance, South America or Luso-speaking Africa, etc. The Portuguese case presents a characteristic in terms of relation and between social movements, so civil society institution that is a little bit different, I think, and which the tools we usually use to study other cases that are forged in more in a northern and western context, we are not always able to detect forms of mobilization and forms of interaction between civil society and state that are typical of of this area and also other areas of the world. So like also Costis was saying before, like not we are used to consider protest something very specific with very visible, and politics are something very visible in the street with very evident. And I think that in the cases of Portugal, the Portuguese case, both in the revolution and also in the decades after and until now, we see many different forms of politics that maybe with our lens is forged in our context, in our university, in our field of research, in social movement studies, for instance, etc. But also in other areas of politics, we are not able to detect this form. So I think that in this case, Portugal can really be a field that help us to revisit the lenses through which we look at social movements and at their relationship with the state.
So that's really interesting. And one of the things that, one of the things that I hear you say in that answer, maybe distinguishes a little bit from Costas's framing of bringing Greece, into the sort of Western European context. And what you're also saying is the reverse, kind of seeing Portugal as a bridge, to Latin America or Africa, that, that accepting that there is a sort of difference, right, of that border region going out from Europe as as opposed to just sort of integrating right into Western Europe. Could you say a little more about that? What are the implications of kind of accepting, right, that Portugal is, perhaps a border state, which is different from saying that it's backward, right? We're not saying, it's backward or lagging, but it's a border state, and it's kind of looking out. And of course, Portugal also had the empire, right? It's looking out as opposed to just, looking up to Western Europe. So can you say a little more about the implications of, of looking at the Portuguese case in that context?
Yeah, I think that this is exactly because we can consider Portugal as a border case with that is bridging different processes, like the processes that are happening in Europe, and there are different processes that are happening in other areas of the world, but also different epistemologies. So in Portugal, we also can see a different, it's also a country where you can see in the way we study both politics and history, and also in sociology, we have perspective that really cross northern and southern perspectives, approaches that cross different worlds. I think it can be really an opportunity, a country that offers many opportunities to consolidate a stronger dialogue between northern and southern perspectives. Exactly being at the border, it can offer this possibility, and I think is one of the main opportunity that Portugal offers to our studies.
Thank you, Guya. All right, so last but not least, we turn to Nicholas Papagogiannis. I hope I didn't butcher your last name too badly. He is a lecturer in European history and a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the University of Stirling. His current research includes 2 projects: the links between migration from Greece to West Germany and sexual transformations in both countries in the 1960s and 70s, first topic, and then the impact of Global South HIV campaigns on relevant collective action in Western Europe since the 1980s. So the center of this discussion today is his monograph entitled Militant Around the Clock: Left-Wing Youth Politics, Leisure and Sexuality in Post-Dictatorship Greece, 1974 to 1981, which was published in 2015 by Bergen Books. And he is also currently co-guest editing a special issue on transnational histories of HIV activism for the Journal of the History of Sexuality. And finally, he's one of the editors of Contemporary European History. Nikos.
Thank you very much, Pamela, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to the organizers of the event today, the Global 60s Colloquium. So I would like to start with a vignette. It was one of the oral testimonies, which also played a key role, like in Kostis' research, in my analysis of the era between 1974 and 81. So one of my interviewees narrated transparently, I quote, that watching progressive, high-quality films, reading classics, these were among the 3 or 4 habits that distinguished left-wing people, and added that we sank a lot even with our friends in the streets. So what he wanted to stress was that youth politics did not revolve solely around manifestos and speeches in Greece between 74 and 81, but they were very closely linked to leisure. So that's exactly what I embarked on, analyzing the complex links between leisure and left-wing youth politics. The broader socio-political context is that the growing internationalization of leisure in the West, which had also reached Greece already in the 1960s, attracted extensive attention from the Greek left already during the 60s in the ways in which the left shaped its cultural politics. The establishment of the authoritarian regime, which ruled Greece from 1967 to 1974, brought such left-wing initiatives to an abrupt end, but youth involvement in left-wing politics was on the rise since the final years of the dictatorship and escalated after the collapse of the authoritarian regime. So my book investigates the relationship between left-wing youth politics and leisure from 1974, the collapse of the dictatorship, until the formation of the socialist government in 1981, which marked a turning point in the sense that that government, the socialist government, aimed to integrate some aspects of left-wing cultural politics from 74 to 81 into the activities fostered by state institutions. Now, the monograph studies the policies of the major left-wing youth groups, pro-Soviet communists, Euro-communists, Marxist-Leninist or Maoist, if you prefer, and the socialist ones, but it also explores the ways in which and the degree to which the agendas of those organizations shaped the leisure pursuits of their members. It focuses on the youth for 2 reasons. One is that the cultural politics of the left concentrated on the youth, which was treated in those groups, to borrow a term employed by Luisa Passerini, as a metaphor for social change. And second, because young left-wingers in Greece in this period were trendsetters in negotiating or even challenging and reformulating those official left-wing cultural politics. So my main argument is that the reciprocal relationship existed between leisure and politics between 74 and 81, with the two fields shaping each other, but in diverse ways. So what I'm analyzing is a non-linear trajectory of those various constellations of politics and leisure, which built on developments in the post-World War II years, but also particularly the last years of the dictatorship in the early 70s. So on the one hand, a dichotomy of the so-called Greek popular traditions as opposed to the so-called American way of life, which was a dichotomy that was prominent, that had appeared already in the cultural politics of the left in the 50s and played a key role in left-wing cultural politics. That dichotomy becomes more rigid from 1974 and throughout the period in question, until 1981 at least, in parts of the left-wing youth, especially the pro-Soviet communist youth, as a means of regulating the acceptable leisure patterns of their members and ensuring their discipline. Concurrently, however, an alternative approach to leisure that embraced cultural hybridity dating back to experimentations of artists, especially in the early 70s, became the basis of a growing reflection in the mid to late 70s on leisure as a means of self-criticism rather than instruction in politics. This tendency was quite important among the Eurocommunists, but also a network of autonomous groups not affiliated with any party, a network that appeared in the late 70s. So cultural hybridity built, but also reinforced a more bottom-up pattern of political organization. So the autonomous young left-wingers in the late 70s were the first left-wing youth subject to self-consciously reject being affiliated to a particular party, and they counterposed the interaction between autonomous movements like the student and the women's ones, whose members would not be guided by any party. So they would be in favor of autonomy on the one hand, and simultaneously they would think that autonomy should be combined with an aptitude for cultural hybridity, for not taxonomizing neatly cultural products in so-called progressive and so-called reactionary or American way of life. So what I have aimed to do is, one, to help diversify scholarship on youth cultures and leisure in Europe in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which has focused on the selective reception of US-American cultural patterns. By contrast, my book, also in sync with Kostis Kornetis, what Kostis has argued about globalization, has showed the importance of a wide array of cultural patterns, including ones from the USA, but also Western Europe, USSR, China, but also Greece. And I also find the notion of globalization, as introduced by Ronald Robertson, very important because it shows the contextualization of transnationally circulating flows in the urban settings, in this case of Athens and Salonika, and how, again, in the case of my research, how those transfers were embedded in a Greek left-wing patriotic narrative. Second, my second aim was in showing those various constellations of politics and leisure to help nuance the argument that in the course of the 70s, what appears is a growing retreat into the private across Western Europe, in a narrative that was, at least then, quite powerful in scholarship produced in Western Europe, in some cases North America, focusing on the new and far left. So more recently, what has been transpiring is that there is an expanding, very important scholarship on feminism and queer activism, including Black feminism and migrant feminism in Western Europe, that has challenged this retreat into the private argument and shows the variability of the links between the collective and the individual. But still, what I find that's quite important and needs more analysis is how the links between the collective and the individual, politics and leisure, how all those fields were combined in Eurocommunist and pro-Soviet communist youth groups, which have played an important role not only in Greece, but in other countries in Europe as well, like Portugal and West Germany, for instance. Finally, in brief, my subsequent research has moved in a more transnational history direction, in the sense that in the book, I analyze the reception of flows of transnationally flowing ideas in Greece. But in my subsequent research, I studied, one, how migration, the movement of people from Greece to West Germany, the main destination of migrant workers from Greece in the 60s and early 70s, how it shaped activism in both countries. And my main finding is that the music composed by Mikis Theodorakis facilitated the convergence of campaigns of left-wingers in Greece and West Germany between 67 and 74, but also after the collapse of the dictatorship in Greece. And last but not least, in terms of a transnational queer history, I have been studying the lives and experiences of transgender people from Greece. And what has emerged is that their persecution by state institutions in Greece did not abate after 74, after the collapse of the dictatorship, but in some cases it became more intense. And as a result, some transgender people migrated, especially to West Berlin, in pursuit of a better life. So this project, the Transnational Queer History Project, confirms an emerging trend in relevant scholarship, including Kostis Kornetis' forthcoming monograph for nuanced social histories of the transition from dictatorship to democracy, which will highlight the meaning of the transition for people from various social backgrounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikos. So one of the things that jumps out to me is kind of building on what Kostis said at the end of his talk about moving away from the spectacular to the ordinary, right? And, in terms of the changes in everyday life, in your case, focusing on leisure as a kind of metaphor for transformation, right? So can I ask you to sort of then go back and connect that, ordinary, the sort of focus on leisure transformation to what does that tell us about the transition? How do we then sort of frame that, right, as part of a bigger story of the transition that moves beyond the sort of spectacular political, right?
Thank you very much. In line with what also Kostis mentioned earlier, I think that the growing importance of the history of everyday life, Alltagsgeschichte, for the study of transitions in Southern Europe is very helpful, very useful, especially the more recent approaches to the history of everyday life that combine the focus on everyday life on so-called ordinary people with an emphasis on the study of spaces, on the spaces where those people interact. And I think that this is very important, this movement beyond the spectacular, for several reasons. I think one of them is how to think about political in relation to social changes. So to what extent does political democratization amount to a democratization of social norms, for instance, which is not a given? So by focusing closely on interactions in everyday life, in various spaces. These could be, from amphitheaters, universities, factories, but also, to bars, nightclubs, to the streets where people sold sex. So a wide array of spaces. We can see perhaps a process that is quite complicated. It can entail elements of a cultural liberalization, but on the other hand, it's not a narrative. It cannot be discerned as part of a narrative of an ever-growing freedom, because there were norms that were resilient or new norms that appeared and excluded specific groups of people. Just to go back to what I mentioned before, trans people who continue to experience widespread prejudice.
So that's, that's fascinating. The other thing that really struck me about your approach, one thing you really focused on in contrast to the other two speakers is sort of the transnational flows, right? Which is different. Transnational flows is not the same thing as just, imbibing ideas from outside, right? It's about the movement. And can you say something about the challenge of really studying? It's easy to talk about transnational flows. It's not always so easy, right, to actually demonstrate them, right, in research. So say something about the challenges of doing that and how you approach that.
Sure. So several challenges. Thank you very much for highlighting this. So a couple of challenges I would like to mention is one, how to combine meaningfully a transnational and comparative history, also of the transitions, because of course there were various flows of people and ideas across space in the 70s, but still national and local contexts could matter. There were differences in legislation, for instance, different social conditions. So on the one hand, it's important to move beyond kind of a historical comparison that treats the units of analysis as static, but on the other hand, the flow of people and ideas that does not homogenize whole regions, right? So how to achieve that in practice when, writing history, I think that's quite an important challenge. The other one, which is quite trivial, but also very important, is the issue of languages, because doing transnational history requires the knowledge of various languages. And by languages, you can think of, English, the different Spanish, Greek, Portuguese, but also being able to understand variations of those languages spoken by different groups in different countries. So this brought me to my latest project on HIV and AIDS activism, which aims to become collaborative, involve a research group, so that we build also on the linguistic knowledge of all the team members. It's not the only way, obviously, but I think that transnational and global history can be very well served through the collaboration of scholars who are proficient in different languages. And this also helped a lot in the volume we have co-edited with Kostis and Irene, to which Guya played a very important role as well on consumption and gender. We built on the knowledge, also linguistic knowledge of all of us, which complemented one another.
Thank you, Nikos. So maybe I can ask a couple of, kind of big questions that, all three of you could, could chime in. And the most obvious one, right, is kind of here we are, as Guya said, at the last moment to say something about the 50th anniversaries, right? So, the major takeaways, kind of looking back, right, 50 years later, and sort of the reverse question is, what are the legacies, right, of those transitions that we're living with today, in a sort of comparative Southern European context, right, coming out from your, Greece or Portugal. So very just broad questions about, that come with this sort of 50th anniversary taking stock. So do you want me to ask one of you to start first, or does someone want to volunteer, or? Guya, was that your hand?
No, I was just saying, as you prefer. If you want to follow the same order, or whatever, as you.
Sure. Kostas, you want to start?
Yeah, I can do that. Can you hear me? Yeah. So yeah, I think it's an interesting 50th. I mean, the 50th anniversary is always, I think, a kind of, I don't know, milestone, right, in terms of how we think about the past. And I've been thinking about the different style of commemoration in the three countries. That in a way also reflects the different transitions, right? In a way, the different type of commemorations for the 50 years anniversary corresponds to the transitional modalities themselves, I think. So you have this big thing happening in Portugal, right? An avalanche of events, a special commissar, which I mean they have been doing for quite some time, but I think this time the commemorative festivities have been really really great, and there was this huge commemorative march on April 25th. So I guess Guya can say something about the academic output, which I cannot, but I've been thinking that in Greece, on the other hand, we have a kind of awkward beginning of the commemorations. So there wasn't much going on, I think, in the beginning of 2024, which in a way kind of reflects the awkwardness in the Greek transition, which is at the same time the dictatorship collapse, so celebration, but Turkey's invasion of Cyprus, so national tragedy. And this kind of bifidus nature of the Greek transition. I mean, there is more, of course. There's a transition from above and the transition from below, and so on. But I think this all created some kind of awkwardness until an important daily center right made a big conference, but mainly with politicians, not with academics, which was an interesting choice, and where they put forward, I think, a political agenda about the 50th anniversary, which is that these are 50 years of Greek modernization. And this is very different from the public narrative from that particular daily, but not only 10 years ago, during the crisis, which was like, oh, the Greek transition was like, or what we call metapolitesi, which is like this very kind of long stretched period of time. It went, it didn't go well. And now we have this idea of modernization, but it's very cherry picking. It's like only the ones we like are. So, for example, Andreas Papandreou, who was the socialist prime minister of the 80s, he's not part of that narrative, which is interesting. And last thing, I think there was a lot going on in terms of commemoration from some kind of institutions which were not. They're not academic institutions. I'm thinking about the National Gallery making actually a comparative exhibition called Democracy, juxtaposing the Greek, the Spanish, and the Portuguese art of the late 60s, early 70s. Very, very interesting. Then the National Library, which also put together a very interesting exhibition called 74 Rapture. So yeah, I don't know. In Spain, there is not even a date set for commemoration. We're almost there. And the way people remember or don't remember or don't commemorate in Spain is also part of the different transitional arrangements.
Thank you. Guya?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So the Portuguese transition, well, as we know, it was through a revolution. So it was much more, the element of rupture was much more intense and deep in a certain way. So this, of course, had a long-term impact, a different level. The level I studied the most was the level of activist trajectory, so the biographies of people, and in the long term, so anti-dictatorship activists that what they are doing now, like also the kind of not the ordinary activists, not just the people that were after included in institutional politics, etc., people that are now unknown, etc., and the level of organization, so the meso level of network organization, democratic practices, and all these things. So I never studied so much the institutional impact of the revolution, but I think that the three levels, micro, meso, and macro, are really deeply interconnected, and the revolution had an impact on the three levels. And one impact I think that it was very important during this decades was, for instance, in in the way that social movements and activists or different actors in Portuguese society that act in politics outside the electoral moments, etc. The way how they look at the institutions. So institutions, for instance, during austerity, where Portuguese institutions were never under attack. So like in other cases, like in Spain and Greece. So social movements never asked, for instance, during austerity, we want real democracy now, because the real democracy is considered the one that was created in the 25th of April, so the values of April. So the idea is that when democracy is seen as under attack, is that the democracy that is by social movements is the democracy associated with the 25th of April values. So there is in a certain way, this also legitimated also the party system that has never been so much under attack by social movements. So the party system existing now, differently from Greece and Spain, is still a little bit the same that was created after the revolution, because all these parties in a certain way agreed in the revolutionary, agreed or they had to agree in the revolutionary values. In a certain way, the constitution also was forged in an environment of mobilization, etc. So this had a very important impact. I think that these are things are much studied by me, by other colleagues, particularly for instance, Robert Fishman. We know very well the work of him. But I think that what is new in this 55th anniversary is that, okay, we have this view of Portuguese institutions that are more in governments, in the state in general, as more inclusive in respect to Greece and Spain because of the revolution. But now this start to be discussed and for like from adopting a more post-colonial perspective. So new readings of the revolution also start saying, okay, but this inclusion had a border, and this border were Afro-descendants and were people from the colonies. It was what happened in the colonies. So these narratives of these people had difficulties to be integrated in the big narrative of the revolution, and this is something that is start happening now. I think this if there is some newness, big newness in this anniversary, I think this is this point. And also because we always think about Portugal as a kind of peaceful country where there are not so strong conflict between police and activists, and police and civil society and police. Well, not so conflictual in terms of clashes, but after this narrative, sometimes they don't look at what happened in the peripheries of the cities or in the prisons, where actually there are high levels of violence and difficult situations. And recent development of situations that are happening now in the peripheral areas of the cities, in the shantytown, etc., with increased police violence. They are also reopening this discussion. To which extent this model of inclusive democracy was inclusive for everybody. We need to start revisiting this narrative.
Great, thank you. And finally, you, Nikos.
Yes, so I've think not much to add to what Kostis has argued. I totally agree. Just very quickly to mention that I think that what should perhaps feature more in the near future in commemorations and reflection on transitions, on the transition in Greece, would be a more intersectional perspective of those legacies. So, for instance, there is some emerging research on how the political environment after the collapse of the dictatorship in Greece, how it helped generate a movement of disabled people in Thessaloniki and Athens. So this is something perhaps that should play a more important role in broader public discussions. So the variety of movements, the variety of the social backgrounds of those who mobilized and how their lives have changed from the 70s up to the present day, which might somehow not be along the lines of modernization, nor of the previous prevalent narrative of the transition as a precursor to the crisis of the 2010s. So we might need more nuanced, inclusive, and intersectional narratives.
So I feel like we're probably out of time, and Martin coming back on the screen is probably the sign of that. So I just personally want to thank all three of you. I thought it was a fascinating both presentations and conversation. So I feel privileged to have been a part of it.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add a question that we got in the chat a second ago, and I think Costas has volunteered for that question. It is the U.S. foreign policy has long included until this day regime change and intervening in the respective foreign territories. The question just was removed, so that's why I'm paraphrasing. The question is, what is the role of the U.S. foreign support for regime change intervention in those particular cases that you are looking at? So this is for all of you, but maybe you want to take this before we close.
Yeah, if I can say one thing, I mean, I think it's a very important question. Actually, in the special issue that Pamela mentioned in Melange, there was one contribution by Antonio Muñoz and Isidoro Secelos Ballos, which was precisely on foreign kind of intervention or the foreign impact in the transitions, in the three transitions, I would say. But I think there are people who have done lots of work on this. I'm thinking about Mario Del Pero in terms of the Portuguese case. I'm thinking about, I don't know, Jenny Laluti in terms of the Greek case. Again, Antonio Muñoz in terms of the Spanish one. But there is a lot of work, and there is a journalistic account by Alex Papagelas in Greece, which is, I think, probably the best account of U.S. infiltration in the Greek transition. Yeah.
Guya, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I actually is not really something I focused my research, but of course is absolutely crucial. So there were, of course, different influences and different interests that also involved in the Portuguese case. We know that of course, Portugal has always been a NATO country, so it's also the real possibility of a revolution is well, or at least of a socialist revolution, as was defended by many actors involved in the process, was not so infinite, let's say. But there also the other cases of big influence was Germany, because Germany was at the very bottom of many different processes, particularly at the origin of the Socialist Party. And this is a story that has been very well narrated by Monica Fonseca. But of course, there were other processes, other mechanisms, other interests involved. But the transnational dimension of the Portuguese Revolution was also a little bit beyond this, because it was also kind of a model or a kind of inspiration and a kind of dream for many leftists around the world that traveled to Portugal. And also there was kind of a moment of dreaming, particularly after the Chile experience. So I think that it was a kind of inspiration also. So different axes, I think.
Thank you, Nikos. Anything to add?
Very quickly to build on Guya's last point about intra-European influences. For the case of Greece, there is a very important emerging scholarship on the interaction between European community institutions and Greek political actors after 1974, like the work of Irini Karamouzi or Christos Tsakas. So yeah, there are various ways in which diplomacy can relate to political transformations also in the case of Greece.
Right. Thank you so much. So we have indeed reached time. So I'm very, very grateful to all of you, to Pamela for moderating this wonderful discussion, to all the three panelists, Guya, Costas, and Nikos. Fantastic to see you again. It's a wonderful reunion. One of the questions that I would have asked was how this anniversary that we are commemorating this year is different, you know, from the 40th and the 30th anniversary. And it's very interesting. Obviously, you hinted at that many of your works, many of your research, you know, was actually published shortly before or shortly after the 40th anniversary. So the question in all of the Global 60s research is, what role are we playing as academics, you know, in these commemorative discourses and remembrances? That would take us for a whole different panel, which we'll have to kick to next year. But thank you so much. Thank you for joining, all of you. Stay tuned for more Global 60s colloquia coming up in the spring, with a specific focus also on Africa and Black Power. So we hope you tune in for that as well. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful evening wherever you are. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.